Thanks. Thank you, Loretto. We come to a second theme this evening, the second session, Living in the Shadow of Empire. And it's a story of the Jews, the ancient Jewish people from Egypt to Rome. You may recognize these words. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. It's a piece of Jewish poetry which belongs to the 8th century BCE and reflects a community experience of darkness and despair, but also an experience of light dawning and therefore hope for a different future. Now, the Christian community has put its own interpretation on this poetry, and the words are often heard through Christian lens at the traditional Christmas service of 9 lessons and carols. But all texts, sacred and secular, have a surplus of meaning. And for Jews, texts are scored for many voices. The all-important Torah has 70 shades of meaning, one Jewish tradition puts it. And for Jews, the interpretive possibilities are endless. Now, Christian interpretation tends towards alignment with a belief or a doctrinal system, which in relation to the Hebrew Bible is not much interested in context. But for Jews, there are 70 shades of meaning, and context is important. And the context of the poetry that we've just quoted is socio-political. A reign of King Ahaz has been a complete disaster, totally dysfunctional, destructive of socio-political and economic community. The people lived in a land of deep darkness. And the poetry goes on to speak of the bar across their shoulders, the rod of the oppressor, the boots of trampling warriors, and all the garments rolled in blood. So the community experience of darkness is of despair and oppression at the hands of the imperial power of Assyria. The bar and the rod are probably a reference to the heavily imposed imperial taxes by the Assyrians. And behind the heavy taxation is the military might of the Assyrian Empire. So this piece of poetry is a stark reminder that ancient Israel's story is shaped by the deep darkness of empire. And that is how successive generations experience life. And from the 13th century BCE to the 1st century CE, life was lived in the shadow of empire. And there is no real understanding of the Hebrew narrative and its expression in its sacred text without understanding the foreground of successive empires. The Hebrew Bible is a world of superpowers, oppressive and dominating systems, which not only birthed the people of Israel, but was their constant life situation for 13 centuries. Now, Christianity, perhaps because it became after 313 CE, it became an imperial religion, being aligned with empire. Christianity has not maybe really paid attention to the imperial context of the text it claims as part of its scripture. Now, every community or nation has its foundational myth of origin. And for the Jewish people, the Exodus story is its myth of origin. Exodus, or liberation from Egyptian political and economic slavery, is thought to have been around 1290 to 1224 BCE, when Ramesses II was pharaoh. Of course, what we read now is 607 years later reflection and telling and retelling of a story that has gone into the shaping of a narrative which we now have. There may be a historical kernel there, but what we read and interpret is what we might call a theological myth, which has become a profound theomyth of hope and liberation for oppressed peoples in many historical experiences of life under domination systems. Now, it didn't develop overnight, that story. No foundational myth of any nation ever does, but centuries of telling and retelling around campfires, writing and editing have shaped a narrative which gives meaning and purpose and identity. We recognize that that foundational story, if you like, was born in resistance to empire, and it reached its present form still in resistance to empire. And that, in many ways, is the ancient Jewish story. Having been born out of resistance to and liberation from Egyptian imperial power, a lot followed in the same kind of vein. And it goes right through until Roman times and the Roman Empire. There were, of course, three other big empires, at least, who were part of that story. One was Assyria, and here was an empire that was in power in the 8th century BCE, and they, through Sargon II, marched on a helpless little nation of people, conquered the capital, Samaria, and terminated the state of Israel. The leading citizens were taken away to other parts of the empire, and after 721 BCE, that little state of Israel disappeared from the political map of the Near East. Now, Assyria, like all empires, then began to decline as a superpower, and its capital Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, and that was the end of the Assyrian story. And the end of that Assyrian empire that had dominated and destroyed a whole community, that story is told in the short little book of Nahum, which we find in the Hebrew Bible. The Assyrian Empire was succeeded by the Babylonian Empire. And this was in an empire that arrived around invading Jerusalem in about 598 BCE, taking some people off into captivity. But it meant that this little kingdom of Judah now was a colonial state, an unwilling and not always subject colony. But Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian leader, was having none of it, and in 587 his Babylonian army marched on Jerusalem, laid waste the temple, the city, and the entire infrastructure of the state, and deported yet another king, along with wealthy, educated, and the civil servants, into exile in Babylon. Now, if the place was not already in ruins, Nebuchadnezzar finished it off completely with a third military attack, and the poor were left in the ruins, and their traumatic, despairing poetry we read in the Hebrew book of Lamentations. And those who were in exile now in Babylon were deeply traumatized in their poetry of the time, weeping by the rivers of Babylon and unable to sing any song, broken and in utter despair. But even Babylon didn't last forever. And the next empire on the horizon was the Persian Empire. And this empire comes into being led by Cyrus. And Cyrus, an emperor, having defeated Babylon, comes to power, and he brings in a new policy. Exiled by the Babylonian imperial power, for the Hebrew people, the exile came to an end in 539 BCE with the Edict of Cyrus. Now, Assyria and Babylon had been oppressive regimes, brutally treating conquered peoples through deportation and exile. Persia reversed this policy, and it does appear in the Hebrew narrative as a more benign kind of empire. Now, this may be positive spin and a propagandist overstatement. It may reflect an attempt at being accommodationist in relation to the empire. The Edict of Cyrus did seem to be a more benign imperial policy, allowing the exiles to return home to Jerusalem, and generally across the empire, allowing some kind of local autonomy of religion and government. But the Hebrews were allowed to return to their homeland. They did in phases, stretching it out over possibly 150 years. Did some settle too well by the rivers of Babylon? But home they came. And it began a whole process of rebuilding a community. Judaism, as we understand it, was established. And sometime in the 5th century, after that edict of Cyrus, a scribe, Ezra, and Nehemiah, more than a temple builder, seemingly a Jewish high-ranking civil servant, or more likely the emperor's man in Jerusalem, reformed and reinterpreted the community faith and values. Now, they did so with a huge tension, not with a little exclusiveness and exclusivity, establishing a pure community, which meant what they called pure seed. Well, there were dangers in that. And it was protested at the time by literary figures and writers of short novels like the books of Ruth and Jonah, and an insightful community ethicist known only to us as 3rd Isaiah, the poet behind radically inclusive community visions of chapter 56 to 66 of the book of Isaiah. Now, all this rebuilding community was a fraught business, especially when still in the shadow of empire, and the empire actually funding the rebuilding project. But it was a moment of huge creativity also, when Torah was completed. But there was also accommodation with the imperial power. It was a tough learning curve for Jewish people. In the Persian era, they did seem to respond with a kind of crucial pragmatism, how to survive and remain faithful or true to essential ethics and values in a political, social, and cultural environment where there was very little sympathy for their faith and ethical claims. They had to learn to resist and not become sucked into imperial power and compromised. So this is broad brushstrokes, the story of ancient Israel. The Persians were succeeded by the Greek Empire, the empire of Alexander the Great, and in turn and time that gave way to the Roman Empire, which brings us up to the time of the Christian Testament and Gospels and letters. So it's a story of empire. It's a story that has the background or foreground rather of superpowers. It is a story that is a story of resistance to empire and to imperialism. And when we read, or if we are part of liturgies on Sundays and we listen to texts from a Bible being read, we perhaps don't always realize, as we ought to realize, that we're listening to texts that were produced in the shadow of empire and a community that was born and continued to exist in resistance to empire. That's the Bible. Okay, Loretto, we can go into groups. Jewish people were born in resistance to empire. What was their struggle? We might want to discuss. And why is this still a profound story of inspiration, of hope and liberation for many in our contemporary world or our modern world? Have a discussion on that for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll come back. You might want to talk about the impact of those three very dominating empires that we have looked at on ancient Jewish experience and their more kind of modern, the more modern experiences that we might be able to think of in response to domination systems. So enjoy a conversation. Let's, having looked at a narrative of a people who, and other peoples who lived through those times in the shadow of all these successive empires, were there patterns of imperial behavior that we can detect and note in that narrative from what we call the Hebrew Bible, or more familiar probably by calling it the Old Testament. It's been put this way: empires, ancient and contemporary, are always about the business of exercising hegemonic control over their presumed spheres of influence. That exercise of hegemony may take place through coercive means, such as the imposition of tax obligations and trade advantage, or it may be enacted by the persuasive imposition of a totalizing narrative that claims for the imperial power legitimate authority. Well, there are some clues maybe: hegemony, taxation, trade advantage, totalizing narrative, all recognizable in the history of empires. The Assyrians terrorized their neighbors and carried out a scorched earth policy. Their so-called peace policy involved deportation and demolition. In their time, it's reckoned 157 mass deportations in total of countries where, places where they conquered. And they even removed fertile topsoil in carts and transferred it to their metropolitan center. So conquest in many cases meant eradication, and they did this successfully, of course, with the northern kingdom of Israel. They eradicated, they eliminated a people and a state from history. Now, core to that behavior was a huge military and administrative apparatus that was designed to secure a constant flow of goods from the edges back into the metropolitan center, if you like. Assyria operated an economy of extraction. The empire became rich. It extracted wealth in various forms from its client states. And at the heart of that was a huge military operation. And of course, they had a totalizing narrative. Assyria even proclaimed the supremacy of the Akkadian Empire, the empire that we looked at last week, the very first one, and proclaimed that supremacy and tried to claim some of its own narrative and story as being in line with that. Well, the Babylonians behaved in a similar way. They too destroyed and deported at huge human cost. Empires can do this. They kill, they take lives either militarily or through famine. And economies of extraction make the elite and imperial establishment very rich, but generally greatly impoverish those who are colonized. And when we take someone like Nebuchadnezzar, we've already mentioned, and his Babylonian greatness, he achieved imperial greatness. And at the heart of his imperial greatness was imperial religion. Every empire seems to produce its own theology, its foundational myths. And the Babylonians had a famous foundational myth that featured the god Marduk and the victory through violence of the god Marduk, and therefore the superiority of Babylonian society and Babylonian empire. Now, the Persian Empire may have been thought to be more humane, but the Persians only put new faces and old patterns. Surviving records from the Persian Empire reveal a tendency towards concentration of wealth, a tendency towards the relative impoverishment of the lowest ranks of the state-controlled agricultural sector. There is prosperity, essentially a system designed to hoard, in those days, precious metals. Now, when the Persian Empire was succeeded by the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great defeated the Persians, and when he did, he was stunned by the bullion wealth he discovered in old Persian centers of power, because in Persia taxation was exceptionally high and ordinary people found life oppressive. Now, the Persians may well have given grant aid, if you like, to the Hebrew rebuilding projects and they seem to have done that, rebuilding a temple, rebuilding a whole community and city, grant aided. But there are no free imperial lunches in history. Now, John Berquist is someone who has studied in depth the experience of former Babylonian exiles, for example, who returned to their homeland under the Persians. And he has summarized how he saw the operations of empire in patterns of imperial behavior. And some of it is like this. Empires are diversified and diffuse systems for organizing human life at large and small scales. The imperial organization is not benign. Empires operate out of the self-interest of the elite rulers. Empires work by domination and exploitation. The empire dominates militarily, not only through conquest, but through the threat of attack. Domination can also be economic. The empire can manipulate the flow of wealth and resources from one part of the empire into another. And when the empire desires, when it feels it needs to, it can impoverish certain areas to punish the inhabitants and people. Empires dominate not only by military and economic means, but also through ideology. Empires create a narrative about themselves that is ideological. And the very idea of empire is a belief that one power, whatever that power is virtually unstoppable, almost omnipresent, and a story that the empire is good for you. So it propagates this belief system, and many people end up accepting it as part of the imperial domination. They buy into the narrative and the story. Empires often use taxation systems and other economic means to control a region's populace, and the economy and the military are often intertwined. Now, these are patterns of imperial behavior that Berquist has identified, and they are patterns that seem not only to apply to empires long ago, in terms of the empires that are at the forefront and foreground of the narrative of the Hebrew Bible. But here are stubborn similarities, someone else has said, of ancient imperial designs towards power and control over wealth and territory and human resources. But there's one other thing that Berquist has also picked out, and that is imperialization is a strong and momentous force in human history, but it always breeds resistance. Now, ancient Israel's story, the narrative we read in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, is a story of resistance to imperial power. And the text of that story, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, cannot be understood without taking life in the shadow of empire seriously. That is the foreground to the text and to the narrative. So in reading the Hebrew Bible and in reading the Christian Testament, we're actually reading resistance literature. Every empire in history has been resisted. And the history of empires is a history of resistance. And of course, eventually, the inevitable imperial collapse. So we can go back into conversation in groups again, and perhaps this time there is a question that might occupy our thinking. Are patterns of imperial behavior recognizable in modern history? These are patterns that have been picked up and recognized in that story from a Hebrew Bible, but are these imperial behavioral patterns recognizable in our modern history? Is this the way in which domination systems appear and operate, whatever they may be. Okay, have a discussion for about 20 minutes again, and then we'll come back and open it up to a general conversation.